Since physical connecting is impossible, virtual platforms have become vehicles of cultural programming. Indeed, the event today is presented on Kunstmatrix, a virtual 3D platform that allows for a vivid and satisfying viewing experience. Unfortunately, we are missing the lively conversation of a cultural gathering, but I encourage everybody, depending on the time of day, to pour a glass of wine or cup of coffee while I introduce the speakers. The Lives of Everyone is curated by Lindsay Harris, a scholar of modern art and architecture with a particular interest in photography. Lindsay received her PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University in 2010. In 2013, she was awarded the prestigious Rome Prize to the American Academy in Rome. She has organized exhibitions at the American Academy in Rome, the Museo Nazionale d'Arte Medievale e Moderna in Matera, and at the Italian Cultural Institute in New York, and contributed to exhibitions at the National Gallery of Art in Washington and the 52nd Venice Biennale. Among her many honors, Lindsay has received the Joan and Stanford Alexander Award from the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, an Andrew Mellon Foundation grant in the Digital Humanities, and of course, the Rome Prize to the American Academy in Rome, where she was most recently the Andrew Mellon Professor of the Humanities. Lindsay is currently completing her book, The Elemental Eye, Primitivism and Photography in Italy, and this exhibition offers a glimpse into Lindsay's research and a sampling of a larger exhibition project for the near future. The visit to the exhibition is moderated by Liana Miuccio. Liana is a lens-based artist and videographer and instructor of media arts at Temple University, Rome. She received her MA from Roma Tre University. Liana's photographs have been published in the New York Times, Vogue, the Boston Globe, Repubblica's D, Il Corriere della Sera, L'Espresso, and L'Internazionale. She has received numerous awards for her photography and videos, including the New York Foundation for the Arts, the National Italian American Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation Arts Organization in Residence program. Liana has exhibited internationally in solo and group shows, including the International Festival of Photography at the Macro Museum in Rome, the Ellis Island Immigration Museum in New York, the University of Pennsylvania's Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and the American Academy in Rome. Her photographs are in the permanent collection of the Museum of the City of New York. Thank you so much to both Lindsay and to Liana. And now as we enter the show, let me explain briefly the format. Emily will navigate us through the exhibition as Lindsay discusses the photographs in conversation with Liana. At the end of the visit, Barbara will monitor the question and answer, so please type in your questions for Lindsay in the chat box, and we'll get back to them at the end of the program. If you would like to revisit the show at your leisure or share it with others, in a few days, the recording will be on the website of NYU alumni and parents, and on the events page of the Temple Rome website. You can also write to me at shara@temple.edu. Thank you, and Liana, the floor is, Liana, the floor is yours.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Shara, Michelle, and Lindsay for inviting me for this opportunity. I actually, as a colleague of Shara and also Lindsay, have spoken to my students at Temple University, and I was fortunate enough to see her Matera exhibition at the American Academy here in Rome, and it's part of also an interesting link to this show as well. So I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to speaking to Lindsay with all of you after her presentation.
Thank you very much, Liana, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. I'd like to welcome especially my family tuning in on two sides of the Atlantic, my family here in Rome and my family in Washington, DC. It's nice to have you here for this fascinating global event. I also want to extend a particular thanks to Shara Wasserman, without whom none of this would have happened. She is a real fire under everybody and gets things done with an aplomb that is admirable. Should all teams have somebody at the helm like this, a lot would get done in the world. So thank you, Shara, for making this possible.
Thank you.
And to everybody else who's here, as Shara and Liana have mentioned. So I'm delighted to be able to share this work with you today and to have this opportunity. When Shara invited me to present my work in this format, I had never heard of Kunstmatrix, and I had no idea what this would look like, but I did know that it would be an opportunity for me to step a toe into the unknown realm of my newest research, For any of you who are scholars out there, you know that transitioning from one project and into the next is a very exciting, but a little bit of an unmoored process. And so it was exciting to get something to ground me, and this is the result of that. My newest research is, or rather the exhibition tells part of a broader story, which is going to be the ultimate aim of my project, which looks at how photography has helped to fuel the free market economy in the 20th century. And as both Shara and Liana have mentioned, this question came to me while working on an exhibition about a small southern Italian town called Matera, which in the 1940s was known as this backward, undeveloped place because of its millennia-old cave dwellings. However, its millennia-old cave dwellings led Matera in 2019 to be a European capital of culture. And one of the photographic campaigns that helped bring about this transformation of perception of place was commissioned by Standard Oil New Jersey. And this, when I discovered it, thanks to the archivists at the University of Louisville, I found fascinating. And I thought, what is this big American oil company doing here in Matera in 1952? And that led me to begin to investigate the Standard Oil archive. This is a treasure trove of images. And beyond the compelling beauty and fascinating compositions and subject matter of the images themselves, is the larger story of the history of photography and the history of economics that these photographs tell. Now, when you typically hear about American documentary photography in the mid-20th century, or even in the first part of the 20th century, usually you think about photographers as crusaders for social justice. And you think about perhaps Dorothea Lange's celebrated migrant mother. You think about Walker Evans' documentation of ordinary American life through humble subjects and ordinary people. And these were, in fact, colleagues who worked for the Farm Security Administration, a government agency in the late 1930s, under the direction of an economist, Roy Stryker. Now, this is the story that most people, if you know things about the first part of the 20th century photography, this is what you know. But mostly you know of American documentary photography as something that brings to light the ills that are plaguing American society. What you don't hear is that these very same photographers, at the exact same time or soon thereafter, were also working for corporate America. And they were publishing their groundbreaking photographs in Fortune magazine. And they were on staff at Life magazine, and they were on staff at Look magazine, and they were, of course, having to make lives for themselves. But this is a story that, while it's known, nobody really talks about it, and nobody really investigates the imagery. The imagery is as compelling as their work of people more on the margins of society for which they are best known. And so this is material that I now want to bring to light. The Standard Oil material is particularly fascinating, in part because it is a vast photographic archive, and Standard Oil, of course, between 1943 and 1956, when this imagery was taken, was a giant of corporate America. And they were faced with an image problem because word had gotten out that they had colluded with German industry during the Second World War. This was, of course, very unfavorable, and they needed to do something to transform their image. So they hired Roy Stryker away from the American government, where he was fairly ready to leave anyway, as far as I've understood from my research. And he brought with him the very same photographers with whom he had already been collaborating for over 5-7 years. And it was really his vision combined with the unique visions of each of the photographers that had worked so well to document the United States situation in the Great Depression that continued then to work well for Standard Oil. And if you want to zoom in there, Emily, on the photograph there, what I think of as our inaugural photograph of the exhibition by Gordon Parks. This is a photograph that he took for Standard Oil with the mandate which all of these photographers received, which was to show the humanity, or that there is a drop of oil in the lives of everyone, hence the title of the show. This was the wording that they used. A drop of oil in the lives of everyone. And when you think about oil industry, probably the first person who comes to mind is not an African-American woman on the Staten Island ferry commuting from one place to another. And yet this is one of the images that Gordon Parks took for this project. And I love this image for many reasons. But first and foremost is really her expression. Now, Gordon Parks is a photographer who came of age taking portraits of African Americans in his hometown in Minnesota. And he then goes on to Chicago and continues to take portraits of middle and upper class African Americans, portraying them with the dignity and beauty that perhaps a history of imagery had not made as the focus of their representation. And he has such a capacity to bring to light the specific situation of this woman, and in her specifics, draw out something universal. And this is something that recurs throughout this exhibition, recurs throughout Parks' photographs, and out throughout many of the photographs in this show. Emily, if you want to zoom out and turn to the right so that we can see two other works by Parks in this exhibition, they begin to reveal, and we'll continue to see throughout the show, how these photographers are bringing to light the humanity of the oil industry. This is perhaps a view of what people may have more typically thought about: a coal worker and a view of the modern city, New York City skyline from under the Manhattan Bridge. These are perhaps more expected images one might think of when you think of the oil industry. But if you can zoom out again, please, Emily, to show the 5 photographs here on the wall by Gordon Parks. Again, with that same dignity of the coal worker that you see there on the left, the way the light hits his skin, the way the sun shines then on the farmer on the far right of the screen. Those 3 photographs on the right-hand side of the column are from a story that Parks took in Augusta, Maine. And one of the other things I found compelling about this material is that the photographers traveled throughout the United States to urban locations, to rural locations, to heartland locations, to coastal locations. And these are places that are represented throughout the exhibition, because I was trying to show the diversity of the imagery. And yet throughout this diversity of the imagery and the diversity of the people represented, there are commonalities that recur in the subjects and also in the compositions. For example, if you look at these 5 images by Parks, the zooming diagonal of the bridge and the deep perspective of what's referred to as a highway in Augusta, Maine, the tree-lined receding road in the center there. There are many of these sight lines that pull you into the images, and this was just one of the ways that the photographers were so adept. These were skills, of course, that they had developed in their lives prior to working for Standard Oil, but they really put them to good work for a series of photographic campaigns that on the surface seem to have really very little to do with a giant of corporate America. Liana, I wonder if maybe we wanted at this point to think about other questions that you might have, and we can use those as a way to then continue to work through the exhibition.
Yes, because as you know, my first love was black and white, photography and documentary photography in New York City, where I first started to study photography. So for me, these images starting out with the Staten Island Fire are very striking. So my question, when I look at these images, as I think about what are the visual, strategies that you think the photographers specifically used in this assignment? Like, is there something that you see in these initial photographs before we see the others that are potentially something that become a thread that we should look for as you go through the exhibit?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Well, the sight lines of the 2, let's say, panoramas or location photographs are one recurring visual motif that you see in the exhibition and in Parks' work generally and throughout these photographers. But more than that, what you are looking at are 2 sets of what are called photo stories. So at their heart, these photographers, through Roy Stryker's instruction in part, and through the mode of photography that was popular at the time, thanks to publications like Life magazine, founded in 1936, and other picture magazines that were really the dominant mode of communication and popular culture in the United States between then and through the advent of television, really, in the late 1950s. What they're doing are telling photo stories. They're photojournalists. They are recounting stories through pictures. And what's nice about being able to see them in exhibition here is that you can see and focus on the images without text. Often when they were published in magazines, or if they were published in books, they were published with texts, some of which were written by the photographers, some of which were written by editors, some of which were written by editors that photographers were not happy about and had no say over. And there's a whole backstory about photographers trying to gain the right to use their images in the ways that they wanted them used, which is actually an interesting point to think about with regard to Standard Oil, because here you have photographers like Gordon Parks, for example. I'll just use him as for instance, because we're focused on his work here. He is a photographer who was driven to show the racism that African Americans experienced, that he himself had experienced, that his colleagues, friends, family experienced day in and day out. And he was able, on some level, to reveal the specifics of African American lives, but really everyone's lives, poor farmers in northern Maine's lives, through these photo stories, even when on payroll for Standard Oil, because Standard Oil gave the photographers a lot of creative freedom. And that was something that the photographers were then compelled to work for big business as a result. But if you see, for example, returning to more specific visual qualities, the coal worker, moving from left to right, the second image, and the Augusta, Maine farm worker, the image on the right-hand side, the far right, in front of a steering wheel, this round image in front of him, you see that the frames around those gentlemen are relatively similar. The cropping is similar. A use of a background color that then distinguishes or sets apart the figure in the foreground. So Parks creates a composition such that he sets up a figure in the foreground and the background. He then, and as was typical of photographers of this generation, those specific focuses on an individual were then coupled with a panorama of the location to situate where does this person's life happen, in Augusta, Maine, near this road, or in a part of New York City near this bridge. And one other thing that Parks in particular has an eye for, which I really enjoy, is his ability to see vernacular uses of photography. So uses of photography in everyday life. Emily, if you want to zoom in on the photograph in the middle there, there's a man with a back to us. What that is a couple posing for a picture in Augusta, Maine, a sailor and his sweetheart getting their photograph taken. And I love that these photographers were aware that photography was really an outsized medium in terms of communicating, showing to Americans what society and culture was at the time. I think today we can empathize with the degree of imagery that we see on Instagram, that we encounter on Facebook, that we encounter on the internet. It's all digital and we see it through screens. I think maybe people are less inclined now to pick up magazines and read printed material, but if you can imagine, it was just everywhere and photographs were everywhere all of a sudden, in a way, in that, let's say, mid 20th century moment, that was exciting. And these photographers are really making it happen. If, Emily, you can zoom out and turn to the wall opposite this, which holds 3 photographs by a photographer, Charlotte Brooks. Yes, here you see that same strategy by another photographer, Charlotte Brooks, a Jewish American photographer who went on soon after her very short career working for Standard Oil, from 43 to 44, I believe it was. She went on in, I believe, 1950 or 1951 to become the first woman staff photographer at Look magazine, which was a competitor to Life, but had a very similar ethos, a democratic slant, a kind of liberal outlook on life. But she went on to work for them on payroll for 20 years. And that was important because women in particular at this time were more often required to be freelancers and to kind of dig for work with one hand while they did the work with the other. But what you see in terms of Brooks's reportage here of a town in Vermont, you see the same overview on the left of the central square, giving you a sense of where we are. We're in this small town nestled in a rural environment. And then you move to the right, and you come to learn eventually that the title of that photograph on the left is Depot Square, and it houses the post office. And then she has this aerial view inspired by modernist radio tower, bird's eye, worm's eye views, using different perspectives, angles to create dynamism, an interior view of the repeated geometric forms within a post office. And then moving to the right again, you see the postal worker, Mr. Gilpin, I believe his name is, at work, delivering a letter to a woman in this town. And this whole suite of photographs, this story about a postal worker in this small town in Vermont, is of course his whole life as a postal worker, driving around, and all the roads he's on is fueled by oil. So oil is there, it's this background. The corporate message is so subtle. This kind of reportage Brooks could have done for a very different aim, and yet here it is for Standard Oil. Did you have another question, Liana?
Yeah, for me, as I look at these, and Emily, is it okay if, can you zoom in a little bit to the images, please, as we talk about them? So I think it's a lot about the details. Thank you so much. I noticed here that a lot of also what is being used are, you know, a variety of angles. There's bird's eye view shots in the first two. They're not taken, you know, at the level. And there also, I see a lot of leading lines in the images that we also saw in the Gordon Park. So do you think that that is a method that you see as repeated? And is it something that helps the viewer to guide the viewer, and the photographers guiding the viewer to what we want to be told?
Absolutely. I mean, these are very, you're hitting on some of the subtle ways that photographers are using their art to guide. It's essentially the vocabulary and the grammar that they are using as journalists through images to recount the story that they want to tell. And this was something that Arthur Rothstein, who was a colleague of these photographers at the Farm Security Administration, which later became the Office of War Information, he writes a very clear article on the photo story and what it is. And he talks about the photojournalist's role as the author of those photo stories as being like a cinematic director, and that you need close-ups and crops and broad panoramas. You need all of those different kinds of viewpoints that you get in a movie, for example, that create dynamism, that create motion, that create moments of relatability. For example, on the right with the gentleman there, the postal worker, who's smoking his cigarette and he's handing a pen to this woman who has her hand extended. It's a very human moment, a very intimate moment. And you think, what am I doing there in this moment? I, as a viewer, how am I there participating? And the photographer has this way of bringing you in. Now that's a real skill. And I, for one, would not feel comfortable going up to people and getting that close to take a picture of a moment like this, which speaks a little bit to their process. Different photographers had clearly different personalities and were better or worse at this, but they would spend time in the places where they went, getting to know the people. Who, you go to a town, you've never been there before, you don't even know who to record. Of course, you think about oil and you think about, I mean, really oil does touch at just about everything between the car and the road and plastic, and it's absolutely everywhere. I'm sitting in an office, I'm probably surrounded by petroleum products, I'm not even aware of it. So it's not necessarily hard to find your subjects, but it is hard to find your subjects because they have to have some kind of hook, something that their individual story speaks to something universal, such that the humanity of the situation comes across.
That's very true, and I think what you said was very interesting about, you know, how do you as a photojournalist, how do they come into a situation where they are unfamiliar with, you know, the town and the people, but then give us access to this intimacy where we feel we are in that moment. So Emily, can you go to the third photograph, please, on the right? This is a great example. You can't imagine that the photographer that right now she is, taking it basically at a dog's eye view or a child's eye view, right? She is crouching down, taking the picture. She's very close. It's a wide angle lens. So, the proximity is probably inches, but yet the photographer is absent here. We only focus on the two individuals. So that's, the power of a successful photojournalist, because we are getting access, especially with photography, which is still, to a moment that otherwise we would never be able to engage in. And that's, to me, is the power of these images and the power of photojournalism. And also, if the one to the left, Emily, if you look at the photograph, please, thank you. And here it's the same way. If in this case, by shooting the bird's eye view, there's absolutely no interruption for the people in below. We're getting access to something that they are not necessarily thinking of the photographer. So you wouldn't be able to get that same perspective if you were on the ground level with them.
I think that's true. Maybe, Emily, at this point, can we go around this wall and look at the next body of work? I think we'll see some of these same approaches recur if you make essentially a U-turn. Yeah. I just, exactly, if you keep going a little bit to the left. Perfect, maybe right here so you can see all of those images together. Yes, I just wanted to stop briefly here to thinking about the point you just made, Liana, about getting into these stories. These are a suite of photographs of Cape Hatteras in New Jersey, North Carolina, Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, by Saul Libson, who was another photographer who had gone through working with Roy Stryker first at the Farm Security Administration and then was brought on board at Standard Oil. And I was so struck by the real beauty of this particular suite of images. Of course, you have the gorgeous coastal lighting, you have the sea, there may be—
Emily, can you zoom in, please?
Oh, sure. If you want to look at the two on the left, for example, Emily, if you could frame the two photographs on the left of the men hauling in pipe and then the fisherman's storehouse. I mean, these two compositions come straight out of art history. I keep thinking, I've mentioned this to Shara, but I was so struck, if you think about kayabots, the workers stripping the floor from a 19th century painting, the emphasis on the body and the study of human forms and musculature. I mean, we're back to ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, looking at how muscles work under skin, and Leonardo's exhuming, looking at bodies and things to understand exactly how all of that works. And yet it's an image of labor. And the photograph on the right of this weathered wooden house, an accessory to labor under this dramatic, Tintoretto kind of sky. I keep thinking about my Italian painting, Titian or something with the gods coming through the clouds. But this is the kind of universality of imagery, that almost unconscious database of imagery that we have in our minds from Western art history anyway. Perhaps a person like me has that more in my mind than most people, but these are still images that are around, and they grab you because there's something, you can almost see the softness of that wood having been beaten by waves and salt, and people opening doors, the weatheredness of a handle. You can feel that texture because of the detail of the imagery, of the image. And something so humble becomes majestic. If you turn around, Emily, to look essentially opposite this wall, and then these are some of the people involved there, the families of the fishermen there on the left. But also speaking, if you stop right there and look at the overview there of recurring visual tropes, you see a lot of these diffused skies with billowing dramatic clouds, and then they are backlighting a series of images in silhouette, people or houses in the foreground. You can think about Victorian black paper cutouts against a white ground for that same kind of history of silhouetting that, of course, an artist like Kara Walker uses to such great success in her art. But here you see that repeated throughout these photographs. And of course, this is one of the joys about being a curator. You bring together the photographs and then you put them on the wall, and then you start to see, oh, wow, they're all using these similar approaches, because they were to a degree, the tools of the trade, the ways that these stories were told, the ways that they worked. You see the receding road, the tree-lined street. But again, that's an image that you see throughout art history in painting. I mean, this is not something these photographers have invented. But one thing that is different and distinguishes this material, this story by Esther Bubbly, for example, on Giulia Caponi. Now here we're moving to Italy. I included these images, of course, because I'm in Rome, and we're in part speaking from the NYU club in Italy. And Esther Bubbly was, in fact, the photographer hired by Standard Oil to document Matera, 2 images of which are further to the right, but we'll stay right here for the time being. And what you see here are another way in which these photographers are good journalists. They get at the universal through the specific. So she's focusing here on this story of this woman, Giuliana Caponi, who is a young woman bus driver. And she's there in that first image having a coffee al bar before she runs off to start driving her bus. Silhouetted in the foreground of the second photograph is what you see there, with somebody helping her load somebody's suitcases onto the top. And then you see her on the road, the newly paved road. Isn't it beautiful, and how not bumpy it will be, and how exciting is this bus travel that's starting to unite Italy? So not only do you see a reportage of a specific woman, you see women starting to get jobs in Italian society, like driving a bus. You see other photographs in this series that I didn't include of her with her 2 young siblings at home reading to them in the evenings. I mean, this is a woman for whom life would have had a very different trajectory a generation prior to this reportage. And yet here she is, she's emancipated, she's gaining independence, she's earning her own salary. The roads are newly paved, the country is getting connected. Things are happening, modernization is underway. And you can see that front and center in these 3 photographs. And this is really at the heart of the book I've been working on for far too long. But what I find so exciting about photography is the way that you can see transformation in process through these suites of images in very small ways. But when you put them all together, you see massive transformation, and you see how people react to that, and you see if that's exciting, or you see if that makes them so nervous. You see the real ambivalence with which people encounter the new.
Lindsay, can I ask about this series? And Emily, can you please zoom in on the first photograph of the on the left, please? Yeah. So to me, as a woman photographer, and also in a male-dominated industry, it's obviously changed since this moment, but it's still, documentary photography still is primarily men. And to me, this is very interesting, to see both the photographer is a woman, and she chose a woman to write the essay about, right? So that's something, that we don't see. And it used to be, that at the bar would be mostly, the older gentlemen, and the wives or the mothers would be home. So, this idea that she's also a pioneer is interesting. And my question is, do you see in the images, because there are many women in this exhibition that you chose, do you see that they have a different sensibility than the male photographers? Is there something that that they bring to it that was new in this moment in time?
That's a great question. I think certainly they bring something that was new. I think on the one hand, it was an opportunity, and on the other hand, it was a limitation, in the sense that women photographers were often almost expected to report perhaps more on women and children in society. So thinking I know we're looking here specifically at Esther Bubbly's photograph, but if I think of her work in the context of Charlotte Brooks, their photographs, many of them include children at school, children, even here, Juliana Caponi is there in the foreground, but you see this small baby in somebody's arms there on the left. I think that maybe women photographers brought to the fore women and children, the rest of society, the people who are, as you say, especially in Italian society, perhaps expected to stay home, but are starting to be out and about. Or even if they are home, these women are able to earn their trust and be invited into their homes so that they can then document them in their domestic environments in a way that perhaps male photographers would not have gotten the same kind of access to that particular kind of subject matter at home. So yes, it's an opportunity. And as I say, it was also a limitation because they were perhaps not allowed then to go out on the oil rig and document the men. For example, the Saul Libson photograph of the man bringing in pipe onto the boat on the coast of New Jersey. Chances are that Esther Bubbly would not have taken that particular photograph, would not have been permitted to take that particular photograph. The oil riggers would just probably have said, no, thanks. I don't think that you're coming. Whereas she was, however, Bubbly in particular was able to break down a lot of barriers. And prior to this reportage of Giulia Caponi, the bus driver, she did a major award-winning reportage on bus travel in the United States for the Office of War Information when bus travel was booming because of war rationing of rubber and other parts that cars required. So with fewer cars, people travel by bus, and she traveled throughout the United States. And in fact, Italy was just one of the handful of countries where Bubbly traveled for Standard Oil. She went to Denmark. She ended up traveling throughout Europe. And I think photojournalism actually gave these women a lot of freedom that they would not have had they had other kinds of professions. So it was exhilarating. It was a wonderful opportunity. It was hard. I think there was a lot of uncertainty. And I'm sure it made traveling is hard on a home life for anybody. So to bring all that together into balance and finance the whole thing was not easy, but there's clearly passion behind it and a passion for people. You can see one of the things that comes across in every one of these photographs is the way in which these photographers are they have a real skill for observation, for seeing in people. I mean, look at that sguardo, look at that look that Juliana has above that coffee cup. I mean, she got her in just the right moment. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly the Cartier-Bresson adage about the decisive moment. It means something. It doesn't have to be just a person leaping over a pond at a particular point in time. It's also about, to capture 4 people in a photograph as you have here. And each one of them, even the baby, has, if that baby were wailing his or her head off, the whole picture would have been thrown out of balance. Mm-hmm. So to capture 4 people at the right moment is a real skill. And you can see that coming across, I think, in Bubbly's work here.
Yes, that's a really good point. And also, to me, what is interesting, and maybe Emily, if it's not too hard to go back to the Staten Island photo for a second on the ferry. To me, the fact that you chose photographers, because obviously, these are all Standard Oil, but what you chose obviously is your curation and what you decided. To me, this idea of, which is a big ethical dilemma in photojournalism, that of the other photographing somebody that is not from their, background, culture. So the idea of, so in this case, it's an African-American photographer photographing, the African-American women. They're of different economic levels, right? Because Garden Parks was, we don't know their economic level, so we can't brand it as, something that, but the idea of culturally, the idea that you're photographing somebody that is maybe more from the inside than from the outside. And how does that change the picture? Or how does that change the photo?
It's a great point. Actually, Emily, if you can zoom out and go back to the body of work to the left. Yeah, on the right-hand side there, but to the right between the windows. So for example, an angle view like that would be great. And then we can zoom in eventually on the preacher who's there on the left. This suite of photographs were taken by the final photographers in this exhibition, Louise and Edwin Roskum, who are a husband and wife team where, speaking about women's opportunities, Louise Roskum collaborates with her husband, takes as many photographs, but in the beginning in particular, it is often his name that we see on their publications. They came to work for Standard Oil through Roy Stryker because they had been publishing before that photographic books. And one of them in particular was a collaboration with Richard Wright, the celebrated African-American author, 12 Million Black Voices, about African-American life in American society. And the Roskums partnered with Wright to produce that book. And there you have an instance of otherness, absolutely. Otherness even in collaboration. And what I've loved reading about, Beverly Brannon is an archivist at the Library of Congress who has done a lot of wonderful research on these photographers who worked for the Farm Security Administration. And I don't remember if it's from an interview with Louise Roskum or research that she had done about her, but she talks about Louise's experience living in Washington, D.C., which of course resonated with me a little bit because I'm from Washington, D.C. But she's there in the 1940s, and Washington, D.C. is in the South, and it was a segregated city. And she was from Philadelphia, came from the North. And she found it shocking, this visual, legal experience of injustice and segregation in daily life. And for her and her husband to collaborate with Richard Wright on that publication, and then the series of photographs that they go on to do with Standard Oil, they seem to me in a way an attempt to begin to bridge the type of racial injustice that they were experiencing for the first time, and how shocking that felt in the nation's capital. Hard to imagine, but alas.
Sorry, I just wanted to interject a second. Emily, can you please zoom in and then pan slowly? That way we can see them a little bit better as Lindsay's talking. Thank you so much, so that we can look at it. Great. And the preacher image.
Yeah, if you want, Emily, the image on the left of the gentleman there with a child. Yeah, so this is a preacher who works at an oil refinery. And there are other images in the series of this gentleman riding his bicycle up and down the oil refinery, an overview of which you saw there on the right. We can see it in a minute. And he's, this is not an image you would think of with relationship to the oil industry. Because on Sundays, this man is a preacher, and he's there outside of his church with his family in this particular extremely dignified portrait. And he has the same, you can see in this gentleman's posture, you can see in his countenance, you can see in the way he holds his head. He has this exact same posture while he's on the bicycle. He's just seated. But you can tell that in the series of photographs that they zoom in on this particular man for a reason. There were lots of people that they could have documented at that refinery, but they chose him. And I think that in that type of selection, therein lies their finger in the eye of the injustices that they were experiencing, because they could show, look how incorrect this approach to life is, if this is the kind of person that then is not afforded an opportunity. Look at the dignity with which he stands before us. And then if you turn to the right, Emily, to show the photographs that are there installed next to the quote unquote windows, I included this particular set of pictures right here, which are of men waiting to get paid. These are the paycheck lines in this oil refinery is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So we're now very much in the South, and we're in the 1940s. And it's segregated, and you have the African-American men at the oil refinery waiting in one line for their paychecks, and you have the Caucasian of undiscernible backgrounds waiting in line at the bottom. And so here you see the reward of working at the refinery. You're there, you get your paycheck. But these two images, they give you a glimpse into a whole culture that these men would have experienced of working at that refinery. And if you zoom out a little bit, Emily, you can see the refinery itself. the big inhumane steel steaming jungle in which those men were working day in and day out. They're all there for a common purpose. The common purpose, of course, to do their jobs at the oil refinery, but also to feed their families, to support their children, to earn a day's wage, to have an honest living. So there are ways in which these photographers really do bring out that humanity, not just of the oil industry, but that humanity that we all share. So there are ways in which, despite the fact that they were working for corporate America, they continued to do the kind of reporting that revealed the iniquities in American society at the time. They did it in a way that supported their patron, but they did it in a way that was true to their artistic vision. And that is one of the things that perhaps in conclusion, I find ultimately heartening about this body of work, and why I think it resonates so much today in particular, and why I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to begin to bring it to really worldwide with this digital format. So maybe at this point we can open up questions from that
And
audience.
I think in the meantime, perhaps Emily should, I think people would like to see a Zoom close-up of the images, so perhaps she can go around the show while people ask questions, and then if we need to, we'll zoom in on the work that's pertinent to the question.
Sure.
Thank you, Lindsay. Barbara.
Liana, I know that you had a first question, so I will let you go first, and then I have 3 follow-up questions by people from our chat. So the floor is yours, Liana.
Oh, okay, thank you. No, I thought there was a connection that as I was looking at this at the end was interesting. And because living here in Italy, we know the treasures that have been, bestowed by having the Roman Catholic Church as this patron and sponsor. And I kind of think the same way as the oil company being able to give us, we had this opportunity. So, we question a lot of times that connection, right? Because it's something that is like the corporation then giving being a patron of the arts. So do you think that was something that was ever a conflict with the photographers? Did you feel like they were ever censored, or did they ever feel like they had to tell a story that was by the perspective of their sponsor?
Oh gosh, well, I can't put words into their mouths, and I'm not deep enough into the research of each particular photographer to reply exactly. But what I do know from what I have seen is that, well, the Roskums in particular, it came out in my reading on their work, they did feel a great deal of discomfort in accepting an invitation to work for Standard Oil. Now, the fact that Roy Stryker served as the segue from the government work that they had been doing before, and working for the American government is also working for a patron. The photographers were not at free liberty, and in fact, Stryker and Walker Evans had a real they butt heads often, from what I've understood, because Evans in particular had a very strong vision that he was going to pursue, and it was or wasn't going to fit what Stryker wanted, and that was too bad. Artists have to stick to their vision, because otherwise they're not going to get very far. But at the same time, they have to make some concessions in order to get paid, unless they're independently wealthy. But patrons are important, and this is a long story in the history of art that's not unique to the 20th century, not unique to corporate or government sponsorship. Finding that balance is, of course, what makes an artist good, and certainly the ones that we know of today are better at it than others who have fallen the way of history.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. I will start with the first questions that I've seen in the chat. The first question is from Riva Wolf, and it goes like this. Have you come upon any statements by Parks or any of the other photographers involved about what working for Standard Oil may have meant to them, generally or in specific instances? And then in parentheses, it's fascinating to see how Parks used the opportunity for his own purposes, as you noted, Lindsay.
Yes, that's a great question. I wish I were further along in my research to be able to answer it more satisfactorily. If this person wants to send in their email address as I pursue this work further, I'd be delighted to be in touch about my discoveries. But I do think it was overall a conflict. Let's say there was a dose of conflict for the majority of the photographers. For Parks in particular, so prior to working for Standard Oil, Parks, as I said, had worked with Roy Stryker, but he had been given the opportunity to do that because he had received a very prestigious Julius Rosenwald grant. And of course, Parks is a unique circumstance because he is a pioneering African-American photographer. He was really out on his own there in terms of working with a dominant white, dominant male. Well, he's himself a male, of course, but he shared, I mean, the photographers that I've put together in this exhibition, I was happy to, what I was aiming to show was that there was a real diversity among the photographers, but that wasn't the norm. These were people who were beginning to break ground in terms of bringing in different voices to tell the stories, to show the stories, different eyes. And Parks is certainly one who broke down a lot of barriers. His being hired then to work for Life magazine as a result of this work. You know, Parks, I admire his work and him as a person. He did just about everything. He worked on trains, he wanted to take photographs so badly, but had a very hard time in the beginning. He was one of something like 10 or 12 children, born in, it was at Kansas. He comes from a rural background, and he really had to make his way. Nobody was there to give him a big hand in the very beginning. But he had a lot of gumption, at least from what I'm reading. He just didn't give up, ever. If he needed more money, he got a job. He did whatever it took so that he could get his cameras, so that he could get commissions, so that he could take pictures for clothing stores. He could take pictures for anything, as long as it got him work, it got him exposure, and it got him to do what he wanted to do. So he was smart. He had a mission, he had a vision, and he knew that he needed other people's support, financial support, in order to get that mission out there and get that vision published and exhibited. So he's, I think, when we were remarking before about the savvy with which these photographers and artists get their message out there, despite the corporate patron or whatever patron that might be, he, I think, is one who succeeded with really great, with a great bang, put it that way.
Thank you, Lindsay. Super. I have a comment actually from somebody who is with us this evening, saying it's, I think, a Sir or Mrs. Kenny. My father's first job was at Standard Oil in the early 60s, and it's fascinating to see the corporation's PR work done through these photographs. Absolutely true. And then we have a question from Alexandra Jacobs. I'm curious about the connection between these photos in their time and the Standard Oil brand, and if this would even be possible today, where brands are so tightly controlled and nothing would be allowed that wouldn't explicitly be representative of the brands. So can you maybe develop on that curious question, like how you feel, Lindsay, about how today's brands or companies would deal with such PR campaigns?
It's a great question. I do think times have changed, certainly. I think that there was a moment, and speaking of the times, as I mentioned, this body of work at Standard Oil was taken between 1943 and 1956. So this is just after the Second World War. This is a moment where the world is reeling from division and horror. And in 1955, for example, at the Museum of Modern Art, they mounted this landmark photography exhibition called The Family of Man, which included photographs by many of the people included in this exhibition, and some 150 or even more photographs in the show. That actually became somewhat of a mission of American diplomacy, because that exhibition then traveled internationally. It was part of the MoMA's traveling exhibition unit to promote healing in some way, because that exhibition really did emphasize the family of man. We are part of a common humanity, of course, at the center of the installation, which was, of course, directed by Edward Steichen, who was a magazine editor, who knew about storytelling through images, and the images were blown up very large and they were small, and it was like walking into a three-dimensional photo story. And at the center of this was a mushroom bomb, as if to say, if we don't focus on the family of man, look at what the consequences could be. So it was a unique moment in history. Now, of course, history repeats itself, and we have, alas, continued to see divisions. And we're living through a great moment of division at the moment. And you'd think that in the middle of a global pandemic, we could find humanity, and people from Pope Francis to the head of the World Health Organization are talking about, why aren't we finding our common humanity to get through this all together? Is there a corporation out there with the same kind of savvy, liberty? You'd have to be big, you'd have to be a Google, you'd have to be an Apple. And in fact, Apple's advertising campaigns have been among the more interesting in the past 10, 15 years that I can think of. It's a good question. I don't know if this kind of campaign could repeat itself.
The
again,
reflection indeed is very intriguing. Now, I mean, to think about what it would be for today's companies to, to get out of the mainstream and maybe see if they can learn from other things from the past as well, and maybe challenge challenge their brands also by reaching out to artists more often, maybe. So it's absolutely an intriguing question. So thank you, Alexandra, for bringing this up. I welcome other questions as well from panelists. And Shara, I see that you raised your hands. Go ahead.
I'm just thinking maybe the Benetton ads
Definitely.
might somehow be a more contemporary interpretation of this kind of branding.
Yes, and not quite as contemporary, but Olivetti, the typewriter magnate, that was certainly a brand that enlisted artists, leading artists of the day in the 60s, 70s, early 80s to work for them and do their advertisements. So, and had a very similar socially minded impetus at the helm of that company. Not to say that Standard Oil necessarily had that. They found themselves in an economic bind and used social justice causes to get out of it.
One way maybe that's a modern interpretation of this is that corporations are now actually reaching out to not only professional photographers through contests and with various themes that are also on social media. And what's happening that's interesting in this moment is that back then you had to be a photographer and with a very expensive piece of equipment to be able to photograph and tell your story. Now corporations are funding projects that are asking everyone who has a smartphone to be able to tell a story. And so that, in a sense, is making it much more democratic because, people have become more sophisticated in their camera skills. And now we have access for more voices than we ever did. So that's possibly another way that it's happening today.
But what about the opposite then point of view, which is that because of the ease with which a digital camera or an iPhone or whatever can take a picture, Lindsay, do you think that something like this, or the previous image of the figures that you referred to as Michelangelesque and Master Leonardesque, whatever, so on, something like this, maybe, this takes time and focus and so on. It isn't a point and shoot digital camera or iPhone kind of image. So, both sides of the coin is always maybe true.
But at the same time, we're not seeing the contact sheet that led to this print. So
that's true.
Libsyn could have taken 17 photographs that didn't work out so well, but he didn't have to print them, and we never ever have to see them.
There was actually the National Geographic photographers at one point were told to go out with a disposable camera. That was, pre phones, and take photographs. Right? So in other words, no manual settings, and they came out with incredible images. So I think it isn't necessarily the tool always, but your eye. And that's where I think the democratic aspect comes, that if you are good, your photos will stand out, even if it's with a phone. So that's potentially, something positive that's come out of the accessibility to photography.
I think that's true.
This has absolutely been wonderful. The audience has been great. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions, or Lindsay, are there any tie-up thoughts that you might have before we thank everybody? Thank you first, of course, in primis, but.
No, I think thanks are a good way to conclude. I think I've said everything that comes to mind at this point.
Well, then thank you to everybody. Thank you to Liana, and to, of course, Emily and Barbara. Michelle, the NYU team, for putting this together. And of course, we look forward, Lindsay, to where this will appear. And as I said in the introduction, in a larger format,
That's the hope. Yeah. And you've really helped me think about how that might actually come to pass. It's one thing to just sit there and ruminate on your ideas, and it's another thing to have somebody forcing you to make them concrete and forcing through a wonderful invitation. And I thank you very much for that. And I know that this will help me move forward. Exactly to what remains to be seen, but somewhere in advance of where I am right now.
So we're here, you've got an audience. So Jay Kenny just says brava.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, brava. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And Riva Wolf says, thank you, fascinating. So those were the two questions that at one point you answered.
Yes, thank you very much.
So Riva is a classmate of mine. We were at the Institute together.
Oh, wow.
That's great.
A couple of years ago.
Nice.
Yeah, I hope people from the Institute are out there this afternoon or this evening, or wherever you are tuning in. So I'm gonna sign off. I'm gonna go have dinner. It's been really
Thank you, everyone. Thank
Thank you very
you.
much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.